The first time I saw Mr. Calloway, I knew I was in trouble. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a presence. The kind that turned heads when he walked into a room, commanding attention with an effortless mix of authority and charm. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, his tailored suits fitting just right, his deep voice smoothing over syllables like warm honey. He wasn't much older than us, early 30s, maybe, but there was something about him, something just out of reach. I told myself it was admiration. Nothing more. But admiration didn't explain the way my stomach twisted when he called my name in class, how my skin burned where his fingers brushed mine when handing back a paper. It didn't explain the way I started watching for him, noticing the way he loosened his tie after a long lecture, the rare moments when he laughed, a real, unguarded laugh. It didn't explain the way my heart raced when I caught him looking at me. The problem was, Mr. Calloway wasn't just intelligent and composed. He was kind, a kind of kindness that made it dangerous to hope. One afternoon, I stayed after class, stuffing my books into my bag slower than necessary. "Need something, Gabriel?" His voice was casual, but there was something in his gaze, something unreadable. I hesitated. Just that last lecture. The symbolism in the picture of Dorian Gray. You mentioned Wilde's personal struggles. I guess I was just thinking about how much of himself he poured into it. Mr. Calloway tilted his head, considering. Literature is often a mirror of the writer's soul. But sometimes it's also a mask. I swallowed. Do you think he wanted people to see through it? A pause. A flicker of something in his expression. Hesitation? Amusement? Then, his lips quirked in a small, knowing smirk. I think some truths are meant to be hidden in plain sight. My breath caught. It was nothing. A literary discussion. An ordinary moment. So why did it feel like something more? For weeks, I told myself I was imagining things. That I was projecting my feelings onto a man who had no idea how much space he occupied in my mind. But then, there were the little things. Like the way his eyes lingered a second too long when we passed in the hallway. The way his posture softened when I spoke in class, as if he was actually listening. The way, when I stayed behind to ask a question, he let the room empty first, only addressing me once the door clicked shut. One evening, as I gathered my things, he cleared his throat. "Gabriel, could you stop by my office tomorrow? There's something I'd like to discuss." My pulse stuttered. "Of course, sir." For a moment, he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small nod, he turned and walked away. I should have been nervous about what he wanted to talk about, but I wasn't. I was thrilled. The next afternoon, I stood outside Mr. Calloway's office, my pulse drumming in my ears. The hallway was empty, the air thick with the scent of old books and worn leather chairs. I hesitated, staring at the polished nameplate on the door. What was I expecting? Some kind of revelation? A quiet confession wrapped in academic formality? Before I could second-guess myself, I knocked. "Come in." I pushed the door open, stepping inside. The office was small but orderly, lined with overstuffed bookshelves, a single desk lamp casting golden light over a neat stack of graded essays. Mr. Calloway sat behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened just enough to suggest exhaustion. He looked up, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "You're punctual," he finally said, his voice lower than usual. I swallowed. "You asked me to be." He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Have a seat." I did, feeling the weight of his gaze as he studied me. There was an energy in the air, something unspoken stretching between us like a live wire. "I wanted to discuss your essay," he said, finally breaking the silence. "Your analysis of repressed desire in Wilde's work was astute. Insightful, even." "Thank you." My voice came out quieter than I intended. "You seem to understand things most students overlook." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. "Where does that understanding come from?" The question felt like a test. I exhaled slowly. "I guess I pay attention to what's left unsaid." Mr. Calloway's lips curled into something almost like a smirk. "That's a dangerous habit, Gabriel." A beat of silence. Something shifted in the room, an unspoken acknowledgement of what neither of us could say outright. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the warmth of the space closing in. "Sir," I started, but my voice trailed off. I didn't know what I wanted to ask. I didn't know if I wanted an answer. He exhaled, a slow and measured thing. Then, before I could stop myself, my hand moved, just slightly, fingertips grazing the edge of his desk. A small movement. A risk. For a moment, he didn't react. Then, as if compelled, his fingers mirrored mine, brushing just close enough that I could feel the heat of his skin. A second passed. Then another. And then, just as quickly, he pulled back. The spell broke. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat, sitting up straighter, retreating behind the professional mask he wore so well. "That will be all, Gabriel." I nodded, swallowing against the tightness in my throat as I stood. My hands trembled slightly as I gathered my bag. I reached for the door handle, but before I could step out, his voice stopped me. "Gabriel." I turned, my breath catching. He hesitated, then exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Be careful what you pay attention to." I didn't know what he meant, but the warning sat heavy in my chest. As I walked out, I could still feel the ghost of his touch. Days passed, but the memory of that moment in Mr. Calloway's office refused to fade. I replayed it obsessively. The way his fingers had hovered just close enough to feel real, the weight of his gaze, the warning in his voice. It had been nothing, and yet it had been everything. He didn't avoid me in class, but something had changed. His posture remained composed, his expression unreadable, but I noticed the way his fingers tensed around his pen when I spoke, the way he sometimes hesitated before calling my name. I wanted to believe I wasn't imagining it, that beneath his controlled exterior, something was unraveling. Then, one evening, everything fell apart. I had stayed late to work on an assignment in the campus library. As I packed up my things, I heard voices from the faculty lounge nearby. One of them was his. I hesitated. I wasn't eavesdropping. I told myself that. I was just listening. "Calloway, you've got a fan," another professor teased. "That kid, Gabriel. He practically worships you." I expected a denial, a polite dismissal. But instead, Mr. Calloway chuckled. "He's young. It's harmless." Something inside me twisted. "Seems more than that," the other man said. "I saw the way he looks at you." Mr. Calloway sighed. "It's a schoolboy crush. He'll get over it." The words felt like a slap. "Well, you must be flattered," the other man continued, laughing. "Not particularly," Mr. Calloway said smoothly. "It's a little predictable, isn't it? These kids latch onto authority figures, convince themselves they feel something profound. But it's never real. Just infatuation." I stepped back, my pulse hammering. The voices blurred, drowned out by the rushing in my ears. It's never real. I had spent weeks second-guessing, dissecting every interaction, every glance, every pause. And all along, I had been nothing more than a passing amusement. A foolish student reading too much into kindness. Heat burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let the tears fall. I turned and walked away, my footsteps steady, my chest hollow. The worst part wasn't that he had rejected me. It was that he had never taken me seriously in the first place. I avoided Mr. Calloway after that night. In class, I kept my answers short, my eyes down. If he noticed the shift, he didn't acknowledge it. The space between us stretched wider, but I let it. I refused to be the foolish student pining after a man who had never seen me as more than a predictable infatuation. But avoidance wasn't enough. The betrayal festered, poisoning every memory I had clung to. And when the hurt turned to anger, I knew I needed closure. So, I went back to his office one last time. The door was slightly ajar when I arrived. I knocked, waiting for his familiar voice. "Come in." I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. He looked up, surprised. "Gabriel." I took a deep breath. "I heard you the other night." A flicker of something passed over his face, guilt, maybe, or regret, but it was gone too fast to be sure. He sat back, steepling his fingers. "I see. Is that all you have to say?" My voice was steady, but my hands curled into fists at my sides. "I thought I mattered to you, even just as a person. But I was a joke to you, wasn't I?" Gabriel, it wasn't like that, he said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. I was in a difficult position. I had to say. You had to say what would protect you. I finished for him. I get it, but it doesn't change the fact that you let me believe something was there, even if you never meant to. Silence stretched between us. For the first time, Mr. Calloway looked uncertain, less composed. I shook my head. You told me to be careful about what I pay attention to. Maybe you should take your own advice. His lips parted as if he wanted to respond, but I didn't wait for him to find the words. I turned and walked out, feeling lighter with every step. I had spent too long searching for meaning in stolen glances and quiet words. But the truth was simpler than I had wanted to believe. Whatever had existed between us, real or imagined, was over. And this time, I was the one walking away. The end.